Perhaps you do not share the same objections as I do to the exploitation of animals by humans. You may feel inclined towards welfare rather than rights, and believe that it is entirely a question of whether animals can be treated with compassion while still commodifying them. But this question really has a two-part answer, and my primary response is not the one that I'm going to explore in detail today. That is no. I'm concerned about animal rights. This means understanding and respecting animals as individuals, and moving away from the human state of entitlement that allows for them to be exploited. Whether the death be quick and painless, the cages clean and spacious, the entire process wasteless. I find this position baseless, and it only keeps the axeman faceless, and I'd beg you be more gracious. I will stop rhyming now. That's a promise. It is simply a perversion of humanity's role in this world, to place ourselves in a position of ownership and authority above all other life on earth. That domination is itself unjust. The second part of this answer, which is the focus of this discussion, we'll focus instead on exploring what if you do feel that it is possible, and you find yourself in the common position of living in some comfort, consuming animal products, soothing your concerns about what those animals experience, or by deferring your responsibility for their suffering to some authority, and trusting in the protections of regulations to enact your will to express mercy and ensure a good quality of life. I'd like to help you understand the reality of how these regulations are determined, and whose interests they really serve. If you have a moment, let's time travel back to 1965. The development of new tech has seen a revolution in technology that simultaneously makes animal agriculture more efficient, and therefore cost-effective, and more evil than ever. Professor Brambell set about to investigate and outline 5 basic freedoms that animals should have. Enter this lovely essay by Ruth Harrison, which I'll be using to illustrate quite what happens to those recommendations. So, enter Ruth to do some of the heavy lifting, or quite a lot of the heavy lifting. This is from a very old book. In fact, so old, I don't think it's in print anymore. I got my copy secondhand quite a while ago, and, well, a fair portion of Ruth's essay kind of just slips out, like this. So, be gone with the book. Okay, so Bramble outlined the following 5 freedoms, basic freedoms, which would be necessary in order for treatment of animals not to be considered cruel. Now, obviously, I don't agree with Bramble and in his conclusions, because I very much think we should just be leaving them alone entirely. But these are, from the welfarist point of view, the standards that were identified, the basic freedoms necessary to avoid cruelty. So his concept of cruelty, given for poultry, would apply equally to other species. I consider the mechanisms, the suppression of which is most stressful, are those which are most frequently called into operation in nature. These, I would say, are 1. Feeding, 2. Locomotion, 3. Preening, or grooming, 4. Social responses, and of course 5. Sleeping and rest. I think these are the basic urges which, to suppress completely, can be regarded as cruel. Unfortunately, action was not taken anywhere near soon enough. By 1967, methods of farming had started to catch up with the technology, and so making changes was a little bit more challenging. But no action was taken until 1967, by which time stocking rates had increased considerably, and then the Agriculture Bill was introduced, embracing more general recommendations. It became law in 1968, redefined suffering as unnecessary pain or unnecessary distress. We won't dwell too much on this, because I am talking about this from the point of view of a welfarist, but it's all unnecessary. We just don't need to interfere with them in any way or cause them any stress or inconvenience. This redefining enabled the minister to make regulations which he promised to do, but has not yet been tabled at the time of her writing this, has not yet tabled any in April 1971. Covering every aspect of the environment of farm animals. Anyhow, on we go. Ruth states that this should have been a great step forward, which many people with a welfarist view would have expected. Codes were drafted which made many departures from Brambell's recommendations, which he then listed. That calves may be fed solely on milk substitute as long as it's complete in all well-known nutrients, that cattle may be stalled or tethered for prolonged periods of time, that entirely slatted floors may be used for cattle and pigs, whereas Brambell recommended a bedded sleeping area, acceptance of sow stalls and cubicles with tethering and without straw, tighter spaces allowed for poultry, acceptance in poultry, and of beak trimming, spectacles and dubbing. So those are the examples that she's listed here in the book. Anyhow, she then goes on to explain in 1969 the debates that have taken place, where we see parties on either side expressing interest in how these regulations and recommendations are going to come into effect. She states perspectives offered on both sides of the argument, with Sir Douglas Glover, the MP for Ormskirk at the time, pinpointing the real issue of the debates. The debate is not about animals, he said. It is about human beings and about the way in which they are in a civilized society treating animals in that society. The question remains, do we, as human beings, go on having a high standard of living because we are doing something to the domestic animal that in our hearts we know we should not do? This House has shown clearly in tonight's debate that the answer is a firm no. And this really should be at the heart of a welfarist concern. We are essentially writing rules and regulations about how to go about doing something that we clearly know is wrong. So this notion that we're doing our best by the animal, we're doing our best to protect the animal, is fantasy. The Bishop of Norwich foreshadowed the attitudes of young people falling out of love with the animal agriculture entirely and wanting no part of it, no jobs, etc. Mr. David Lang of Cambridge pointed out the 6 most urgent amendments. First, any animal should at least have room to turn around freely. Second, a dry bedded area should be provided for all stock. Third, palatable roughage must be readily available for all calves after 1 week of age. Fourth, sows may only be kept in stalls for feeding and straw must be provided. Fifth, the Brambell recommendations for space for all poultry must be substituted for the recommendations in the Code of Practice. Sixth, skip-a-day feeding systems, beak trimming of fowl, spectacles, and the dubbing of combs after the age of 5 days must be made illegal. Now, this is a little bit half-arsed, but that's as much as is being put forward, and to someone with a welfarist point of view, surely you would say that anything short of that is abuse. It's agreed that it's abuse. That's the whole point of the conversation. This is what he's outlining as the basics that need to be done in order to be considered in a system that we already know is unfair and oppresses animals, but in order to avoid unnecessary cruelty. But what happens? We start from the position of trying to outline what it means to be cruel, what it means to treat them with dignity, and then who actually makes the call on those regulations? Well, now we move to the perspective on the other side of the debate, with outrageous claims like those made from Mr. William Ross, or the Secretary of State for Scotland, commenting on the space allowance for calves. Turning around may not be advisable from the point of view of the animal. Just what the hell was he thinking? David Ensor, declaring an interest in the poultry industry, said, "I doubt whether there are many children in this country who live in such comfortable circumstances as some of these birds do." He then mentioned a 3-bird battery cage brought into the house to demonstrate the inability of birds confined in it to stretch their wings, and commented, "These birds, with a lifespan of about 18 months, live in extremely hygienic and comfortable circumstances." This is absolutely outrageous. If you take comfort in any kind of regulations to do your moral thinking for you, to defer your moral accountabilities to, this is who you have in the room debating. And on Walk the Debate, from the point of view as trying to introduce a basic standard of not causing unnecessary, which I would still find objectionable, but not causing unnecessary suffering to these animals, we walk from the point of what is outlined to then conclusions such as, if pure Brambell was out of reach, commented Anthony Stoddart, it is clear that a marriage has to be attempted between the practical and the ideal. The standards asked for by Brambell are just about double those laid out in the codes, argued Lord Nugent. It could not be right to start with something which is a unique development in the field of livestock management by setting up standards as high as that. So we have come from the point of saying this is the minimum that is necessary to not cause unnecessary harm, to a point where we say that minimum is now the ideal, and we must compromise that minimum standard with what is practical for us to enact. We are saying that the bar must be lower than what is necessary in order to avoid cruelty, and this is why welfarism does not work, and this is why you cannot defer your moral accountability to other people who are protecting the interest of the industry and not the animals to do your moral thinking for you. And soon we'll be coming back to shrug off our little time travel adventure and wake up back again in 2021. No, I think I might stay in 1969 on second thoughts. Ruth explains that the next step was for this to be investigated. This investigation is carried out on behalf of humans who are invested in their industries remaining successful and having what is practical enacted. So they surveyed 4,154 units, and in 9% of them physical pain and distress were discovered. This was the only type of distress that the profession felt capable of assessing, so that the following conditions were not condemned. So essentially we're ignoring any kind of, everything that was described in Brambell's report. If you think about preening, sleeping, etc., that those aren't physical stressors. So we're literally looking for physical pain and not any of the things that Brambell outlined. So in the interest of avoiding cruelty in these industries, we're starting from a point of having these individual stressors explained. We've debated them to the point of saying that we're to compromise that basic level with what's practical, and now we're investigating those stressors for signs of physical pain, which would be very unlikely to be seen. Anyhow, in 63 out of 70 veal units visited, pens were not wide enough to allow calves to lie down and extend their limbs at right angles to their bodies. In the majority of units, the report stated the calves were unable to turn around after the 6th or 7th week of life, and in their last 2 or 3 weeks of life, many of them also had difficulty in grooming. In some units, in which sows are kept for the majority of their lives in stalls, where the pen partitions extended to floor level, we found that sows could not lie down and extend their legs in the normal position because of the limited width of the stall. Veterinary officers were generally of the opinion that in the poultry units inspected, all turkeys and all domestic fowl, other than those in cages, were able, without difficulty, to stand, normally, turn around and stretch their wings. The repeated assurances that their conditions did not cause distress to the animals are as much a reflection of the veterinary surgeons as the units. The statement, under the heading Scientific Approach in the report of the Advisory Committee, that the argument that all animals have a fundamental right to be able to turn around is essentially anthropomorphic, there is no justification for revising the codes to permit animals to turn around, also reflects badly on those who drew it up. Ruth goes on to express that each and every animal is an individual with a slightly different capacity for adaptations from its fellows. These differences clearly marked between different breeds, but exist also within the breeds amongst individuals. Dr. Woodgush has described how birds in battery cages make a nest of air before laying their eggs. Some also try to dust bath. Of those two types of hybrid layer, more than 90% of white leghorns and less than 10% of the heavier hybrids spend at least 45 minutes in a very restless state before laying. It would seem, when formulating such systems, that from the welfare point of view, it would be better to modify the system to suit the least adaptable animal rather than the most adaptable, as is now so often the case. I would seriously question any system which placed severe restraint on all animals for the benefit of the few weaklings, as in the Beale cage system for piglets. She goes on to illustrate what should be the concern of any welfarist when deferring their own moral accountability to councils and debates and research such as we've seen. If you think that you can trust them to look after the interest of animals bred for your consumption, and you believe that they are looking out for avoiding unnecessary stress for these animals, then You should be interested to understand that while we might think that animals are being protected against stress, which Ruth identifies as our interpretation, generally as the layman think of it in terms of prolonged discomfort or pressure in his life, the scientist's conception is a more acute one. He looks on it as an upset of homeostasis, which, if unchecked, leads inevitably to death. The tendency is towards increased stocking rates, but decreased lifespans. Ruth questions, have the effects of less than acute discomfort or distress time to show? And is there time for disease other than infant disease to manifest itself? Do we really, as civilized people, draw the line at the point where the animal ceases to be productive? In other words, at the measure of stress the animal can endure during its short life. Ruth describes that science has made it possible to treat animals as things, but because it is possible, does it mean we have the right to do so? What then can be done? To work for the welfare of another is to try to make life worth living for another being. The severely deprived battery hens, white fetal calves, and immobilized sows and fattening pigs do not live, they only exist. This statement is something surely I can't imagine that anyone would see the scenes that I hope by now we've all seen, and if you haven't, please, there will be links below. Go watch Dominion, go check out some of the other videos that I'll share with you. If you don't know how accurate that is, you must see it. If what you value is animal welfare, you must not accept that that is the best that we can do, and that is the best that we can give to animals, simply enabling their existence. Well, that is until we permit ourselves to take it away. And while I know there are some who knee-jerk into priding themselves about not caring at all about the suffering and the experiences of animals, I do find, in general, humans aren't just monsters, and typically it is descriptive of most people that I know. Most people accept the position of eating meat only on condition that the animal has pleasure in its life while it lives and is then humanely slaughtered. In no instance can these two criteria be guaranteed today. Many people have become so repulsed by the situation that they have taken the first step towards opting out of it by becoming vegetarians. I use the phrase first step because much suffering is involved in the supply of dairy produce. The vegan who attempts to eschew all animal products and byproducts takes the most logical step towards elimination of cruelty, a step to which only a very small but gallant minority have so far devoted their lives. Ruth concludes, it is impossible for any individual member of the public or any individual farmer to reverse trends, but very simply for the government to do so through the support system. We must, as a nation, decide which systems are biologically and ethically acceptable, and then make sure that the farmer is adequately recompensed for using these humane systems. Now, I don't agree entirely with everything that Ruth has said in her essay. That's not a statement of total agreement, but I think she illustrates very well what really happens and who is really served by these regulations. At the minimum standards for treating animals without cruelty, outlined, walked back, investigated by parties interested and invested in keeping things as they are, profitable and efficient, no changes to regulations, the public deceived into trusting and believing that regulations exist to ensure the fair and kind treatment of animals as we know they have been reviewed, and essentially animals continuing to endure long-term extreme suffering and deprivation. This is not good enough. This is welfare. This is recommendations that might align to your expectations. Your expectations are that regulations will identify animals' needs and enforce their protections. What we see here is a report in 1965, followed by debates in 1969, the demotion of a basic identified right as being an ideal, the will to compromise on this ideal, in keeping with the status quo, a conclusion that animals do not really need enough space to turn around. When you delegate your accountability to the crypt keeper, you cannot be surprised that there are skeletons in the closet. Anyhow, I hope that this has fleshed out their bones a little. Regulations fail to protect animals and are designed by those interested and for those interested in the existing industry, providing little to no challenge or disruption. You are accountable for your own morality, and I urge you to empower yourself to take charge of your values. Be brave to face reality. Do not believe the convenient lies of regulations and welfare. They exist to deceive you, to harm animals and protect the industry only.